You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 12th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. It's 1400 in Moscow, midday here in London, 11 a.m. in Reykjavik and 7 a.m. in Havana. You're listening to Monocle Radio. The Briefing starts now. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme.
This is a new era in America, and I think it goes against the ilk of who we are as Americans and our faith in the criminal justice system. In the end, this jury of ordinary people from Delaware were not intimidated by that family. And they recognized that this was a clear-cut case and that clearly no one's above the law.
The conviction of the president's son following the conviction of the former president prompts severe cognitive dissonance in American conservative media. Also ahead, Cuba attempts to entice tourists from Russia and China. Like the good old days, the wheels of justice at Guantanamo Bay continue to grind slowly. Later in the show, whale meat again. Iceland issues a controversial hunting license and...
Mike, there's a storm coming. Things are going to get bad. We're going to be tested. Just know we're good.
Incredibly, cinema of that quality does not seem to be attracting people to the movies. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Welcome to today's edition of The Briefing. I'm Andrew Muller. In the United States, seething conservatives are pivoting from their fevered critiques of a politicised justice system to a conspiracy theory which posits that the president has railroaded his own son to make it look like the justice system isn't politicised. This follows yesterday's conviction of Hunter Biden on charges relating to his purchase of a gun while claiming not to be addicted to drugs. He may well face imprisonment. Well, joining us now is Washington DC correspondent Simon Marks. Simon, let's start with a couple of the saner responses. What have we heard about this from President Biden?
Well, from President Biden, Andrew, we saw immediate action after that verdict came in yesterday. He hastily tore up his schedule for the rest of the day. The White House press briefing was cancelled as the building went into damage limitation mode, and President Biden left the city after making a brief appearance, ironically, at an event about gun violence and his administration's efforts to try and take action to curb it. He hastily made his way to Wilmington, Delaware, where he met his son, his daughter-in-law, and his grandson on the tarmac of an airfield and engaged in a hug for all of them. And for several minutes, he and Hunter Biden talked to one another away from the microphones that were unable to pick up any of the discussion between the two of them. But the president also issued a statement saying so many families who have had loved ones battle addiction, understanding the feeling of pride, seeing someone you love come out the other side and being so strong and resilient in recovery. He reiterated that he would accept the outcome of the case. He'd said last week that he will not pardon his son in the event that the jury convicted him. And he said he will continue to respect the judicial process as Hunter considers an appeal. Jill, a reference to the First Lady, and I will always be there for Hunter and the rest of the family with our love and support. Nothing will ever change that, the president wrote.
Is there any consensus on whether this will make the least bit of difference to his electoral prospects? I mean, obviously, as you point out, there are many, many thousands of American families which will have some first-hand understanding of what the Bidens have been going through, but it will be flammed up inevitably by his conservative media opponents.
Yes, although interestingly, the response from Donald Trump and his campaign was relatively sedate. They described the outcome of this trial as nothing more than a distraction because they've got their eye on the legal calendar that lies ahead for Hunter Biden, and particularly the second trial that he's going to face this year on tax evasion charges in California, which they think could be more fruitful in terms, they hope will be more fruitful in terms of providing any evidence to support their claim that Hunter Biden and his father, the president, are part of an organised crime family, claims that are repeatedly made without any evidence to back them up so far. In terms of the electoral impact, I think nobody really currently expects this to move the needle. If you're a supporter of Joe Biden, then you probably have understanding of the difficulties that the family is going through and an appreciation for the love that Joe Biden has shown to his son. But if you're a Republican supporter of Donald Trump, then nothing that has happened at this trial is going to make you likely to reconsider that decision. There is, though, one big opportunity for this issue to impact the election stakes, and it's coming later this month in that first televised debate between President Biden and former President Donald Trump. Biden advisors are saying that they believe this gives the president a chance, first of all, to undermine Republican claims that there's a two-tier justice system in the United States, but also, secondly, to drive a real contrast between himself as a man at the centre of his family life, a man who interrupted what he was doing yesterday in order to travel to Wilmington to be with his son, and Donald Trump, who very much did not see enormous amounts of support, certainly from his wife, former First Lady Melania, as he was going through his criminal trial over hush money payments made to Stormy Daniels in New York. So the debate itself could get pretty fiery on this issue.
And just finally, are we seeing yet any indication of how conservative media plans to deal with its cognitive dissonance? Because obviously, had Hunter Biden been acquitted, that's easy for them. They can just go into the whole one law for them, another law for us, etc. But given that Hunter Biden has been convicted and that the president has said he will absolutely respect whatever the justice system determines, that's quite a hard case for them to make, isn't it?
Well, it is a hard case to make, and it's a hard case to make generally, Andrew, given that there are other prominent Democrats who are facing the criminal justice system at the moment, including Senator Bob Menendez, former chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who's facing a corruption trial in Manhattan, and also a prominent Democrat from Texas, Congressman Henry Cuellar, who has recently been accused by prosecutors of accepting bribes, a case that may well come to trial in the next few months. The Hunter Biden issue, though, is complicated for the White House and for Democrats, because remember that originally there was a plea deal that was struck that was supposed to obviate the need for this trial. And it was that plea deal that led many Republicans to argue, hang on a second, there's a two-tier justice system at work here. The judge in the case, the judge who then presided over the trial, at the 11th hour and 59th minute, ripped up the plea deal. She didn't like it, and she said, I'm not simply going to be a rubber stamp. So in the Hunter Biden case, it's not quite a binary issue, because there are still enormous questions about how that plea deal that the judge ripped up came into existence in the first place.
Simon Marks, thank you as always for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing. Here is George Ruskin with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. Hamas has submitted its response to the US-backed UN-approved peace plan for Gaza, with an amendment that Israel must commit to a permanent ceasefire. Israel has not yet commented publicly, but a White House spokesperson described the submission as helpful and said US officials are evaluating the request. Haiti has a new government, with a new cabinet completely replacing all the ministers of previous Prime Minister Ariel Henry, who was forced to step down earlier this year by gangs who control large portions of the nation. The priority of interim Prime Minister Gary Conny and his cabinet will be to try to restore order to the violence-ravaged nation. And one of France's best-loved singer-songwriters, Françoise Hardy, has died at the age of 80. Hardy burst onto the music scene in 1962, known for her melancholy ballads. She recorded nearly 30 albums and modelled for designers like Yves Saint Laurent and Paco Rabanne. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, George. You're listening to The Briefing. I'm Andrew Muller. For obvious enough reasons, many countries are less enthused about Russian tourists than they were 3 summers ago. An exception is Cuba, the tourism sector of which is still struggling to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and the economy of which in general is still struggling to recover from Fidel Castro. Cuba has stepped up enticements to Russian and Chinese visitors in particular, and in a related indication of warmed relations between Moscow and Havana, 4 Russian naval vessels are due in Cuba today, which is fine, as Russian deployments to Cuba hardly ever lead to anything bad. Joining us to discuss this is Dr. Emily Morris, Honorary Senior Research Fellow at University College London's Institute of the Americas. Emily, first of all, is there a simple reason why Cuba's tourist economy has cratered like this? It used to be the one thing on which they really could rely.
Yeah, it's interesting. The rest of the Caribbean has now recovered to pre-COVID levels, but Cuba is still around half its previous level on the whole. The reason, well, there are several reasons, but it's mainly because the economy is struggling, but in particular, the US sanctions have caused a lot of the flights to be cancelled. And so a lot of people from Europe, there's much less traffic coming from Europe in particular. It's down at about a third of its pre-COVID level. And then another interesting thing is that the US, when there was a boom in US arrivals during the Obama administration, the tour operators were all very excited about Cuba. There was a lot of very positive, marketing and all the rest of it. And then what happened is it wasn't just a boom in arrivals from the US, but a boom in arrivals from the rest of the world as well, because of this kind of sense that Cuba was the place to go. So that was a boom time. And then since then, of course, the US market is much lower than it was before, but also the public image of Cuba has been deteriorated hugely, because there's been, of course, in the US, a kind of a sense that Cuba is somehow dangerous. There was that whole business about the so-called sonic attacks, which proved to be an empty thing. But this kind of idea that Cuba is a dangerous and difficult place, which it is no more dangerous and difficult than it was before, but it's in economic crisis, the situation, it's not as comfortable for tourists as it was before, but mainly the tour operators aren't pushing Cuba. They've been put off by the whole situation, and payments is very, very difficult because of in 2021, the US put Cuba on the state-sponsored terrorism list, which means that foreign operators find it very, very difficult to process payments between outside Cuba and Cuba.
So what kind of enticements are they offering to Russian and Chinese visitors? How are they reassuring them on all those fronts?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, the Russians, that they're trying to attract them, and it's the only country on the list of main sources of tourism where the numbers are now higher than they were in 2018. They're now 30% above. So it's been a big marketing push. It's been flights have resumed. Payments are much more easy. So there's been a big marketing push in those places. I mean, the Chinese numbers haven't recovered to their previous level, but they're working on that one as well. So there are lots of package tours that they're doing now from Russia, which is interesting. So they're kind of taking the place of the Europeans in that sense. I mean, the Canadians are back to just 15% below what they were before. And Canadians are mainly package tourists as well. So those tour operators have started to move back in. But from Europe, it's very difficult now to get to Cuba because of the lack of flights.
We should talk a bit about this naval visit as well. As I understand that it is the frigate, the Admiral Gorshkov, a submarine, the Kazan, and 2 accompanying support ships. The United States does seem to be at pains to not get excited about this. Is this visit really anything other than something that happens pretty regularly?
Yeah, it's not that significant, except, I mean, it is. The Cuba's relations with Russia is significant in that they are there's definitely getting warmer towards Russia. There's definitely Russian investment coming in. It's not huge, but Russian credits, very important for Cuba because of their lack of access to international finance. And so they're kind of aligning themselves with Russia much more than they did before. Of course, politically, they have nothing in common with, ideologically with Russia. We're not in the Soviet period. But they have, in a sense, they've been forced to look for credits wherever they can get them. And Russia is now offering it for its own reasons. But so Cuba is taking advantage of that, in particular Russian fuel shipments and fertilizers and credits. I think that's the areas of most importance for Cuba. So in a sense, what the US actions have done is they've really forced Cuba to a closer relationship with Russia. And Russia has if you like, taken advantage of that in terms of kind of symbolically, I suppose. But it's nothing, I mean, it's not a real political alliance. It's not a real economic dependence. But it's certainly in Cuba's interests to cultivate relations with Russia at the moment.
Dr. Emily Morris, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio, and sticking with Cuba, the detention camp within the US Navy base at Guantanamo Bay may seem like an obsolete relic of the early 21st century, and very arguably is, but it remains home to 30 prisoners. One of them, former al-Qaeda commander Abdulhadi al-Iraqi, is still edging towards a date with justice 18 years into his incarceration. Jury selection for the sentencing phase of his trial is taking place this week, and for more on this, I'm joined now by the journalist H.J. Mai, who is staying at the Guantanamo Bay base hotel. H.J., first of all, Abdulhadi al-Iraqi, who basically is he and what is the case against him?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. The U.S. alleges that he's a former al-Qaeda commander. He according to U.S., the U.S. rap sheet, he was a senior figure in al-Qaeda since the mid-1990s. He's an Iraqi citizen. According to the U.S., he was involved in attacks on U.S. and allied forces as well as civilians in Afghanistan and Pakistan during the early stages of the war on terror. He was captured in 2006 in Turkey and then transferred to Guantanamo in 2007. And as you mentioned, he has been here ever since. And he pleaded guilty to 4 charges 2 years ago. And we are now entering this sentencing phase where he faces a minimum of 25 years.
Is it clear why this has taken so long?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many logistical challenges, trying those detainees, especially those forever detainees who have been here for so long. In his case specifically, he also has a spinal cord issue that required several, surgeries over the years. I mean, when you look at him in the courtroom, he can barely move. So that has delayed things. There have been many legal challenges, as you can imagine, with the history of Guantanamo and what has happened here or has, been alleged has happened here, in terms of torture and other things. This has all, put this really sometimes to a standstill. I mean, he was initially charged in 2014, so his case has now been, ongoing for 10 years.
So how does this phase of his trial work?
Yeah, so after he pled guilty, as I mentioned, 2 years ago to those 4 charges, so this week the U.S. flew in 22, jury members or potential jury members to Guantanamo. They will go through the regular vetting process, like any other jury. They're all military members, of course, because this is a military commission here in Guantanamo. And the process started yesterday. So there were 22 members, after an initial round of questioning. The judge and in collaboration with the defense team and the prosecution, they already threw out 4 people. And then after another round of individual questioning of those potential jurors, another 2 were eliminated. So we're down to 16. The hope is to have a jury panel set by the end of this week. And then from there, at the moment, the trial schedule or the sentencing schedule is set to allow about 2 weeks for witness testimony, other testimony, and then basically the jury to deliberate on the correct sentence for Mr. Hadi al-Iraqi.
I mean, is this going to make a fundamental difference to his future, though? Is he going to end up serving whatever the sentence is wherever he already is?
I mean, that's the big question here. So there has been some reporting out there that even though, the jury will decide on a minimum sentence of 25 years, that there have already been deals in the background in place that would be reduced to less than 10 years in the end. And the goal for the U.S. and for most people here in Guantanamo, and especially for the Biden administration, is to find a country that will take him. Due to his physical condition, that makes it a little bit harder for him. So the U.S. would have not only to find a country who's willing to take in an alleged terrorist, but also has the medical facilities to take care of him going forward. And so this is also has made it more difficult. I mean, there, as you mentioned earlier, there are still more than 30 or around 30 detainees here. And the Biden administration is trying really hard to get them off the island and find third countries to take those. There was a deal in place apparently ahead of October 7th, ahead of the Hamas attack on Israel, but that attack derailed everything. This once again, I mean, it's 22 years now since Guantanamo, since the military prison here opened, and we're still talking about it.
22 years since it opened, and if I've done the maths right, about 16 years since Barack Obama was elected president, partially on a promise to close it. But is what you've outlined there, the difficulty of finding anywhere else willing to take these people, the reason that it has proved impossible to close it?
I mean, that's really what, back, as you mentioned, over a decade now ago, the Obama administration found out that that has been difficult. And as you're probably aware, Republicans also made sure that no detainee could have been transferred, to the mainland U.S. to a security facility or a prison there. And so, the Biden administration is in the same boat with like the Obama administration. I mean, as you know, Biden was the former vice president under Obama, so he has seen this all firsthand. And they're running into the same issues. And I think the longer this continues and this is ongoing, the more challenging it will be to find suitable, can call them host countries for those alleged terrorists, even though, I mean, there's so many, close to 16 or so have already been, signed off on. They're ready to be transferred. Some of them have never been charged with any crime, but still countries are not willing to take them. And that's definitely, according to the administration, what's most difficult to finally wind this military prison down here.
H.J. Mai in Guantanamo Bay, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. It is famously difficult to hunt whales and look good doing it. Global opinion serenely unbothered by the countless other marine creatures hauled out of the oceans every day can be relied upon to hoist pitchforks at any commercial whaling, which is possibly why only 3 countries still load their harpoon guns at scale: Japan, Norway and Iceland. The latter of these has just issued a new licence to the Icelandic whaling company Valur, which will allow them to catch 128 fin whales this hunting season. Well, I'm joined now from Reykjavik by the journalist Lara Ómarsdóttir. Lara, first of all, how is the government justifying this licence? Why do they think this is an okay thing to do?
The reason is probably that whaling is permitted by law, and while the legislature does not change the law and prohibit whaling, it's difficult for the government to not issue a license to hunt. I think that's probably the main reason, because the Minister of Food said that the decision is not according to her opinion on the matter, but she needs to follow the law and the regulations. So that's the conclusion.
Is this a controversial subject, though, in Iceland? Is it something that excites great passions among public and politicians?
Yes, it is. It's like the country is divided in half. It's 50-50 pro or against whaling here in Iceland. So yeah, it's a hot topic.
I mean, how big how big a business is it, though? I mean, obviously, fishing is a huge, vital industry for Iceland. Is whaling of anything like that scale?
No, not at all. There's only one company that hunts for whale in Iceland, and that's Hvalur, and it has done so since 1948, on and off. Of course, but so no, it's not very big, but it is though. It produces some amount of money, but it's not like big as fishery in general. But it's not likely that we're gonna fish any whales this summer because the manager director of Hvalur says that the license issued yesterday is it's only for this summer. It's going to kill the business, he says. There's no predictability in this license because it's not for 5 years like the law says it needs to be. So he's not optimistic that he will hunt for whales this summer.
So, assuming they do manage to catch any whales at all, and just finally, what does become of the whale products? Are there many Icelanders who still consume them?
No, not really. All of it goes to Japan, so it's not for domestic markets. No.
Lara Ómarsdóttir in Reykjavik, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. In the United States, it is very much not shaping up as a golden summer at the cinema box office. Takings are down 24% on last year and are still 42% down on the last pre-COVID summer. In particular, once reliable marks like Ghostbusters, Planet of the Apes and Mad Max are not packing them in as they once did. Well, I'm joined with more on this by the culture journalist and critic Gabe Bullard. Gabe, is this just due to the fact that people have not got out of their pandemic-era habits of staying at home?
That could be part of it. I think that people are reevaluating still their relationship to going out to the movies. I think the other part of it is that we're seeing a sort of odd summer given the pipeline issues created by the two big Hollywood strikes that that has really put a delay on a number of titles coming out.
I'm not sure whether this is a factor in the prejudice which I'm about to shamelessly insert into the interview, but is part of the problem, or has anybody considered that the problem might be that a lot of these films are formulaic, boring and somewhat silly?
Well, I think that we see so many sequels and prequels and continued IPs and franchises coming out. That's really all that's out there. Even the top performing movies like Dune Part 2 is Part 2. So I think that what we're seeing is that every franchise has a ceiling to it. It has its baseline number of fans who are going to go. But to really get somebody in when you're talking about the third, fourth, fifth movie in a series where maybe the first one came out 25, 30 years ago, I think that's going to be a hard lift no matter what. People who haven't been following closely, who aren't those super fans, probably feel like they've seen it before. And in many cases, they probably have seen it before.
Is there any angst, though, as well, about some modern particulars of the cinema experience, though? One, obviously, that it can be quite ruinously expensive, especially when you think this is something I'll be able to watch on TV in due course, or possibly even now. Plus the fact that cinemas are increasingly full of furtive vapors and compulsive phone fiddlers.
That could be a big part of it as well. I think that, at least in some of my theater experiences, shortly after the pandemic, when theaters reopened, a lot of people had maybe forgotten proper etiquette in the theaters and definitely looking at their phones, a lot of small screens lighting up. I think one finding or idea that I can glean from some of this too is that some movies that we do see doing well are ones that make the case for seeing them in the theater. I mentioned Dune. That's one, big landscape shots and everything. I think a lot of people wanted to see that on the big screen. Other movies that are maybe a little bit smaller but did pretty well are like the movie Civil War, which was one where people kind of wanted to be in the conversation about it, that it was one of these movies that felt important to see or at least to have an opinion on while it was out there. A lot of other movies, yeah, I think that people can just sort of wait until it's on television. And when we see something happen like the studio take the movie The Fall Guy and put it on streaming as soon as there's a little bit of weakness at the box office, I think that's really only sending the message to people that, yeah, you know what, I can stay home. This is the longer I wait to go to the theater, the more things are going to come to me. I
mean, is it possible then that we are on the verge, it may have happened to be happening already, of a bifurcation in cinema, that those studios trying to get people to come to the movies will track towards the spectacular and all sensational, whereby I guess, dare I say it, the more cerebral offerings may become more of a home offering?
I think that we are going to really see a lot more data on this in the next year whenever some of those movies that had been delayed through the strikes start coming out. But I think the big signal that we're getting right now is this movie Hitman from Richard Linklater. Beloved director. It's getting great reviews. It is on Netflix. It was very briefly in theaters. Almost nobody was able to see it or went to see it. But I'm just seeing so much conversation around people watching it on Netflix that if that's going to be the way that movies that are maybe a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more original, they're done by these directors who have, if not a history in the art house, at least respect from the art house. If those are just going to streaming, then yeah, I think that we're going to end up seeing a lot more of the big special effects blockbusters on the big screen, but the more thoughtful movies coming to streaming.
Gabe Bullard, thank you for joining us. That is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Vincent McAvaney, our researcher was George Ruskin, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing returns tomorrow at the same time, midday UK. I'm Andrew Muller. Thanks for listening.